In the original Animal Crossing for the GameCube, there are special furniture items that feature fully functional NES games that you can play in your house. This means you can drop the item in your house and interact with it to play a full NES game within the game. There are quite a few of these NES items, and most are obtainable through normal means, such as buying them from Nooks or finding them through standard villager interactions. However, there exist 4 specific NES items within the game files that are not obtainable through normal means. The community has dubbed these the Forbidden 4, and these games are Ice Climber, Mario Bros., Super Mario Bros., and The Legend of Zelda. These items do not appear in any shop, raffle, or event in the game, and were thought to be unobtainable. However, there does exist a mechanic within the game where you can tell Tom Nook a secret code and get special items. Nintendo published these codes on their website periodically to give players items back in the early 2000s. The community has since reverse engineered these codes, and we are now able to generate secret codes ourselves to make Tom Nook give us practically any item in the game. So, we can just generate a secret code for those 4 NES items and obtain them that way, right? Unfortunately not. These 4 NES games are specifically blacklisted from being obtained via Tom Nook's secret codes. So even though we can go through the process of theoretically generating secret codes to obtain these items, entering the codes does not work due to this blacklist. So, are we just out of luck then? Well, not yet. In the early 2000s, Nintendo was also experimenting with a concept called the e-reader, which linked to a Game Boy Advance and allowed physical cards to be scanned to get rewards in-game. Think present-day Amiibo, but all the way back in 2002. Animal Crossing is one of the games that supported the e-reader when linked to the GameCube, and there are a plethora of cards released for the Animal Crossing series. On May 12, 2003, Nintendo released Series 4 of the e-reader card packs and made 2 of our forbidden NES games attainable for the first time by scanning 2 specific cards at the post office. These cards were N01 Ice Climber and N02 Mario Bros., and are to this day the only ways possible to obtain these items legitimately in-game. To do this, you would need the e-reader peripheral, a Game Boy Advance, and a link cable to connect it all to your GameCube. Needless to say, this process was a bit cumbersome and it wasn't very popular in North America. Ever since Nintendo released these 2 cards, it was thought that they would eventually release the other 2 cards to unlock Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. However, due to the commercial failure of the e-reader in North America, these cards were never printed. You see, e-reader cards work by having their data encoded physically onto the card in the form of a dot code. Similar to any barcode you see at the grocery store, these dot codes store data about the card and is what actually gets scanned when you swipe the card through the e-reader. Due to this, it's long been theorized that a certain e-reader dot code must possibly exist to scan in-game and finally get Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda, even if Nintendo never printed these dot codes themselves. Many have tried to replicate the Mario Bros. And Ice Climbers cards, but to my knowledge, nobody has ever been able to create a functional dot code that works on console to obtain Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. That is, until now. Over 20 years after the game's release and after some painstaking reverse engineering, I can finally report that I've created a working e-reader dot code card that can be printed and scanned in-game to give you both items legitimately for the first time. This can be done on a vanilla console with no hacks, no action replay, and no memory editing for the very first time. You simply print the card using a printer and scan using a North American e-reader, and both items are yours in-game legitimately. So, how is this possible? Why is this only happening now, 20 years after the game's release? If this process was theorized to work from the start, how come nobody ever did this before? Well, to start, I am definitely not the first person to be interested in doing this. Researching, there are several threads and posts about people wanting to accomplish this exact same thing. However, the e-reader is a very niche piece of technology, and not a lot of people develop for it. The peripheral and its associated card data aren't super well documented or understood, and most of the information you find will be from pre-2004. Nevertheless, I was fully dedicated to finally crack this and make this work, so I scanned dozens of early internet documents, I used a Wayback Machine to find archive links, and I generally collected all the knowledge I could about the e-reader. To explain how my work eventually functioned, this was made possible by taking the existing Animal Crossing e-reader cards, extracting their dot code data, and modifying certain flags to create a new dot code with new data. More specifically, I decompiled existing card data as a base, made modifications to it, and recompiled it replicating Nintendo's compression methods to create a new working card. This took quite a bit of time and research to accomplish, especially since e-reader documentation is extremely dated. That said, I hope to detail and document my process further, so you can stick around for some technical details because I think it's pretty interesting. If you're only interested in downloading the working dot codes to use or print for yourself, you can skip to the end of the video or see the description. Alright, this part of the video is going to focus on technical details, and just as a fair warning, if you're not really familiar with basic programming or file management, then I'm assuming a lot of this information is going to go over your head. However, I thought a lot of this information was interesting, and I figured I'd include it here for anyone who's interested. So all e-reader cards start as raw files that can then be converted into bin files for viewing in a hex editor. As a bin file, the Animal Crossing cards that can be scanned in the post office are split into 3 chunks, one containing header data, one containing VPK data for the Game Boy Advance, and one containing VPK data for the GameCube. The header data contains general information and checksums about the card, including the dot code size and the size of the VPK. When modifying e-reader cards, this header is crucial to keep consistent. If the strip size, region, general size, VPK size, or any of the various checksums are incorrect, then the card will give a read error when scanned. The next chunk in these cards contains VPK data specifically for the Game Boy Advance. That is, this is the data that gets read by the GBA when you simply scan the card in the e-reader BIOS. Most Animal Crossing e-reader cards have this data to include a special letter that shows up on the GBA when scanned, accompanied by a special background and character music. Now, this data is not actually important when modifying the cards to get in-game items for Animal Crossing, but it is required to be there for the card to function. Now, the important part of this chunk comes from the padding that occurs after the initial VPK data, but before the start of the GameCube VPK data. This padding controls the letter item that you receive in the mail when you scan the card in Animal Crossing. For the sake of receiving NES games as a present in the letter, this letter data must remain exactly the same. In this example, you can see this letter is programmed to be from Tom Nook. The final chunk of data is the GameCube VPK. Different from the letter item, this data controls the letter contents as well as what item is present. Both of these are modifiable, so you can receive a letter with customized text as well as most items as an attached present. These must remain within the constraints of the game, however, so no going beyond the letter text limit and no attaching items that cannot normally be attached to letters. Now, obtaining Animal Crossing e-reader cards in a raw format is quite simple following a few Google searches. However, it is a lot more difficult than simply opening these files and changing some item code data. You see, e-reader cards come in a compressed state, meaning their data is mostly gibberish to the human eye unless we decompile them. Luckily, 2 people named Kate Sith and Tim Sherwigan took an interest in decompiling the e-reader from 2004 to 2007. They created various tools that decompile and recompile card data that allows them to be read and modified by eye. Their work and programs are all published on Kate Sith's website, which is still live to this day. Further, custom Python code created by GameFAQs user Rolling Star was also instrumental in automating the decompiling process. While this code was ultimately unfinished, I was able to write further code and patch a few bugs to complete their original intention. With these programs in hand, I was finally able to decompile the e-reader cards from RAW, to bin, to VPK, and finally down to its bare source file. In these source files, you can actually read the data in a hex editor and make modifications. So I was finally off to the races figuring out where I can make the changes. However, as mentioned, the process is not as simple as just modifying the data and recompiling. The tools used were actually great at decompiling data, but were actually too efficient at recompiling data. If you recall, the header data in each e-reader card has to have a general size and a VPK size flag that must be correct in order for the card to not give an error. That means any change in VPK size or card size must be accounted for in the header. Now, this was usually always the case since the tools used always resulted in a recompiled card that was smaller in size than originally started with. You see, the e-reader was developed in collaboration between Nintendo, Creatures, and HAL Laboratories, but it's thought that the compression techniques for the peripheral were developed by HAL directly. This is because the VPK0 compression format present in the e-reader cards are also present in several HAL N64 games, including Super Smash Bros. We do know that HAL used 2 encoding algorithms in their VPK0 compression, including Huffman encoding. However, we do not know the exact settings they used for the e-reader, so I had to find a workaround in order to replicate their compression process. Ultimately, this meant that I needed to modify the header data to accurately flag the VPK size and the general size of the card. So, revisiting this diagram, the VPK size here is denoted by the final 2 bytes of this header data. Note that these are written in Little Endian, so the VPK size here is actually 05 dB in hexadecimal or 1499 in decimal. Thus, when recompiling a new VPK, I had to make note of the size and change this value to the proper hexadecimal declaring the new size of the VPK. If this value is off by a single digit, the card will not read. Further, there is also a general size info flag, which also keeps track of the VPK size. In green here, the hexadecimal 020BBA22 is actually 32 bits of information written in binary, with bits 9 through 23 repeating the VPK size, plus an additional 2 bytes for where the size is declared. Now, that was a lot of technical information, but with that, we can actually do some bit math to properly rewrite the size info flag to accurately represent newly recompressed data. So for example here, I take the original size of 05 dB and add 2 to it as the read bytes to get a value of 05 dd. I then convert this value and the general size value to binary and see that bits 9 through 23 line up exactly. I then convert my new VPK size of 05b4 into binary and replace bits 9 through 23 in the general size flag to create a new binary number. I then convert this binary number back into hexadecimal to get a new flag. With this formula, I was able to recreate the general size flag within the header to accurately represent any newly compressed data. There is still a problem, however, as there is a global check to ensure that the total size of any e-reader card is exactly 2112 bytes. Since the compression brings us well below this limit, we simply fill the data with 00 or FF as blank padding data to ensure the card size is correct. On top of all of this, there are still 2 checksum flags in the header that need to be corrected. Mathematically, these checksums are the complement of the sum of all half-words in all data fragments. Now, this can be done manually, but luckily user Blackshark from Project Pokemon created a program to correct all of these checksums automatically. This was originally created for use with the Pokemon e-reader cards, but luckily this code can also be repurposed here for the Animal Crossing ones. Big thanks to Blackshark for also posting about the previous math and the formulas, which made the process easier. With all these programs and complications settled, we can now successfully decompile and recompile e-reader card data accurately. So, as mentioned previously, I decompiled one of the Animal Crossing e-reader cards, I used this as a base to write a new card, and recompiled that card through the process described previously. From this, I was able to generate a working RAW file that was properly scanned in Dolphin Emulator, and gave me a working Super Mario Bros. Furniture item in-game for the first time. From here, it was time to generate and print a physical dot code based off this RAW file, and finally test on console. To actually print the dot codes physically, you will need access to a modern printer with at least 600 by 600 dpi printing resolution and high-quality glossy photo paper. Converting the raw files into printable dot codes can be challenging, but luckily Tim Sherwagan again has developed a tool to easily print them all the way back in 2004 that still works today. Now, most modern inkjet or laser printers are capable of printing accurate dot codes, but this may be a trial and error process depending on the type of printer you have. I've linked a very helpful video tutorial in the description that might be helpful for you if you're trying to do this. Me personally, I have a Canon TR4722, and these are my printer settings if you want to use them as reference. With this done, you can see I can actually print the dot code physically on a piece of paper, and I'll now test it in-game as the first video evidence of this being done on console. This will be done with an external camera to prove that this is a real video with no editing tricks. So you can see here I have a vanilla GameCube hooked up to a Game Boy Advance SP, which is then hooked up to the e-reader and linked to the GameCube. You can see I also have my physical dot code printed on a piece of paper. And I have everything ready to go in the post office in-game in Animal Crossing. I already have the Animal Crossing software on my Game Boy Advance, so I'm just going to hit read card here and get ready to scan the printed dot code that I have on the piece of paper. You might notice that I scan this piece of paper very slowly, and that's because I'm trying to keep it as straight as possible, because if you bend the paper, you're going to get a read error. In this case, the read was successful, and the custom letter with the Legend of Zelda is being sent to my home. You can see the letter arrived in the mail, and I've even written custom text in the letter to make it as authentic as possible. And at last, here is our working copy of The Legend of Zelda, and I also have done this with Super Mario Bros. Now, let's go inside and test them out. I'm going to speed up this portion of the video simply because I'm just testing both games here. But do know that this video is fully uncut, this is just simply sped up. If you're interested in watching the video with no edits at all, you can follow the link in the description to get a full video of the console testing. So there you have it. Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda obtained in Animal Crossing via an e-reader code, the only way possible on a vanilla console. While this isn't technically an official release by Nintendo, this is still as close as we're ever going to get to one, and all the methods here were done replicating the way Nintendo would actually produce an e-reader code. So for all intents and purposes, I consider this a legitimate method, albeit an unofficial one. If you're interested in downloading these cards, I have links in the description, so you can try these codes out for yourself. Now, I'd like to iterate that this project could not have been accomplished by myself, and I'd like to thank several people for posting their findings for me to use as research. Trust me, without any of these people, this project would not have been possible, so huge thank you to all of them. And with that, this has been the first successful creation of Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda codes that work in Animal Crossing. If you're curious to read more about this video is also available in a document format with some more details. Since this process was also painstakingly long to research, I created a full step-by-step tutorial and hosted code on my own GitHub if anyone ever wants to create their own e-reader codes. You can find both links in the description. Thank you so much for taking interest in this and watching this video. Have a good one.